they saw relational databases as a major bottleneck for their operations. And so they kind of started from base principles and said, well, do we need to have tables? Do we need to have SQL query language? Do we need to have anything except a key to get and set and delete pieces of data? And so when you start there, then you can do some interesting things with scale and distributed computing. And I think that's kind of where the big NoSQL explosion started as a buzzword.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 219. What is NoSQL? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, we've talked about databases a lot recently. We've talked to people from Planet Scale and other places. But one thing we've never really talked about, other than just cursory speaking about it, is NoSQL databases. We poke fun at NoSQL, but what does that tell us? I mean, has it been around for enough time?
Oh, it's been around for quite some time, right? I think we moved away from this is a novelty to this is here to stay, right? And it's up to us to decide what to use depending on the use case, right? So it's not a novelty anymore. But it would be interesting. It's not a novelty that NoSQL exists. But then when we talk about all the variations of NoSQL, that's a never-ending story, right? It can be almost anything in a way, right? As long as it's not only SQL.
Maybe that's what it should have been called, is not only SQL instead of NoSQL.
But isn't that the shortcut?
I don't know. We'll find out because we have a guest on to talk about this today. Gee, go figure. How did we do this at such a perfect time? We've got Matt Groves on from Couchbase. Matt, how you doing?
Doing great. Darren, thanks for having me on the show.
You're with Couchbase. Mongo is one of the big ones. There's generic vendor-specific ones such as DynamoDB, and we can go on forever. I guess what we could say is NoSQL was the, how can I say it, OpenAI of the early 2000s. It was all the hotness. Everybody was raging about NoSQL, just like how everybody's raging about OpenAI and AI technologies today.
I mean, I was around in those days, and I kind of treated it like I was around in the industry those days. I kind of treated it like you guys were saying, just kind of like a joke, like a novelty, something that's like maybe a fad that only the people out in the West Coast startups are using. They don't need to, because I was very much into relational databases. I was hardcore SQL Server. My very first job out of college was Microsoft Access, another relational database. So, I mean, I remember there being a buzz and going around Twitter and stuff, but I remember just kind of being like, that's something that those big tech companies use that, the rest of us out here we don't really care about that sort of thing. That's what I remember from those days.
Why would anybody replace something that hasn't changed for 20 years and is proven to work?
Right, exactly.
So what was the history behind, since you work for a NoSQL vendor? I'm sure you have a bigger, broader, because how long have you been at Couchbase?
I've been at Couchbase just over 7 years.
7 years.
Hard to believe.
16? Yeah. 2015, 2016 is when you started there.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. 2016.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that means you've had time to sort of sit in this now, and you've heard the horror stories, not just from your side, but from across the spectrum. Take us back to what you believe was the first NoSQL.
Well, if we're talking about the NoSQL buzzword, then we might have to start with something like CouchDB and MongoDB. Those are kind of the first two big ones. They kind of came out of a couple different papers from Google and Amazon. Google had the Big Table paper, and Amazon had the Dynamo paper. Now, those kind of predate their releases of Big Table and Dynamo to the public, but they were dealing with extraordinarily large scale. Obviously, Google and Amazon, right? So they saw relational databases as a major bottleneck for their operations. And so they kind of started from base principles and said, well, do we need to have tables? Do we need to have SQL query language? Do we need to have anything except a key to get and set and delete pieces of data? And so when you start there, then you can do some interesting things with scale and distributed computing. And I think that's kind of where the big NoSQL explosion started as a buzzword. Actually, I think CouchDB predated those things a little bit, which has its own interesting history as well. But 2006, 2007, that's kind of when NoSQL became like a big buzzword because those papers were released.
So we're aware of both of those coming from vendors. Now we fast forward in 10, now 15 years. We had the big video. Do you remember was it extra normal video about doing web scale with Mongo? That's definitely not safe for work. You can still find it on YouTube. So just extra normal web scale. That's all you have to go Google and you will find it. And don't have any children or execs around you. There will be meltdowns on all fronts. But that was sort of the joke back then is, hey, it's web scale. It can do anything. From your perspective, and you come from relational. So what made you go to the dark side to NoSQL from relational? Because I'm an old school Microsoft Sybase DBA from the 90s.
Well, I mean, far be it from me to defend our competitor and that video about web scale. But in my point of view, that video was more about just like kind of blindly accepting marketing without questioning the actual technology behind the scenes, right? NoSQL has certainly matured and changed a lot since those days. So it's something that might have been, startups and Hacker News buzz back in the day, but these days, I can tell you, at least from Couchbase's point of view, we're very much enterprise focused, just as much so as the traditional Sybase, SQL Server, Oracle type of databases. But I mean, for me, like I said, it was kind of a periphery thing in those days, NoSQL. But I was working on a product team at the time, and I was exploring some ways to kind of better track usage of our product. We had a massive product with tons of endpoints, and no one really had a good handle on how much each of these endpoints were being used by our customers. So I proposed some sort of tracking system for that, and I initially started writing data to a relational database. And this was a huge amount of data, and writing it to relational on every endpoint operation added a lot of overhead to it. People I was working with said, why don't we look into NoSQL? There's some lower latency options there. And this is not necessarily mission critical data, so this might be a good place to test out NoSQL. And that's when I really started getting into it, looking into NoSQL. And started exploring it some more. And one of the companies I came across was Couchbase. And they appealed to me beyond just the standard NoSQL technology because they were actually heavily invested in SQL as the query language for their JSON data. So it was kind of a paradox to me. It was a NoSQL database with SQL. And I said, well, that sounds like the best of both worlds. Let me check this out some more. And that's how I got looking into Couchbase and eventually joined as a developer advocate there. So that was my end to NoSQL was. I love SQL as a language. I've been using it my whole career. I don't think we should throw that away. It's a powerful declarative language. Let's apply that to JSON data as well.
I feel, and I might be completely wrong because this is not really my area of expertise, that the term itself, NoSQL, was very useful back in the days to show that actually not everything has to be like this, right? Whatever this is in a day. But I feel that today it's almost confusing, the term NoSQL, right? Because we should rather be talking about what it does, right? Is it a document store? Is it a key value store? Is it SQL? Is it JSON? Is it in memory? Kind of, it became maybe too big of an umbrella to be called even NoSQL these days. And again, not my expertise, right? So I might be completely wrong. More of a feeling, let's say.
I 100% agree with that. In fact, I used to present a session at conferences called I Have a NoSQL Toaster, because under such a wide umbrella, I could consider a toaster being a data storage system. So it's a meaningful term in the sense of, let's try something besides traditional relational, but once we get beyond that, it doesn't have much of a technical definition. So I agree. You need to get into at least a more detailed umbrella term of the different subtypes, you could say, of NoSQL. And there's four main ones, right? So document you mentioned, and that's the one I mostly work with, but there's also the basic key value. There's graph databases, and then there's the wide table databases. So, and those all have different ways of working with data, different types of operations and methods of storing and accessing data. So I think it's more useful when you're discussing databases to use one of those terms instead of just NoSQL, because that can mean a wide variety of things to different people. If I say NoSQL to one person, it might mean something different than another.
Could we add a fifth to that list?
There are definitely more than those four. There's a type I actually used to use way back in the day for mobile applications called an object database. And then there's a time series, and there's a hierarchical. And in fact, if you want to get really historical, I'd say the very first commercial database was in the late 50s, called IBM Sabre. And this predates the relational model. So this is the original NoSQL database. It was a hierarchical, more like a file system type of database. So NoSQL in that sense has been around longer than relational.
I was trying to nudge you a little bit towards one of the things that keeps on getting talked about today is vector databases around the large language models, right? So am I throwing you under the bus by bringing that up right now?
I have not looked into vector databases. It sounds similar to a graph database just by the name, but I don't know what that actually means as a vector database. No, sorry.
We won't live there then. We'll move on from there. Okay. Again, showing my age, back in the 80s, I was working with a thing called Pick Basic and Unidata and Universe, which was funny because those were called post-relational databases, but it was in the 80s and now we're in the 2020s. And why is that post and not pre? Who knows? We've laid these things out. So when people think NoSQL, I would have to, and forgive me, but most people are probably going to think Mongo, or they're going to think whatever their vendor has in their systems. But then we called out those differences: document versus key value versus whatever. Why is there so much confusion around that? Again, you've already mentioned is like we should refer to them as what they are. Why is that so hard?
I think as developers, it is challenging to keep up, to say the least, to keep up with all the different new technologies that are out there, right? Just as we've been recording for 13 minutes, there's probably been, 13 new JavaScript frameworks pop up, for instance, right? So, a lot of times a developer is, when it comes to databases, they're generally relatively sticky, right? It's hard to switch from one database to another. It's hard to make that jump unless you have very specific pain points or need of a certain feature. So I think it's just something that kind of falls to the bottom of the list of things I want to learn about, right? So therefore it becomes just kind of osmosis, stuff I pick up on while I'm out there in social media or I'm at conferences. Someone may be talking about NoSQL in passing, and they may be talking specifically about Cassandra. And then when I go and look into document databases, well, that doesn't make any sense because Cassandra is not a document database. So what they're talking about doesn't match up with what I'm seeing. So that can lead to confusion, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think just shorthand buzzwords, it's kind of a hazard in our line of work. And I think that's one of the reasons that get confused about different types of databases, right? Unless we're in them every day, like I am.
Well, why aren't people in databases every day? Because that seems to be where all the money's being made. I mean, a large language model is effectively a data store. And I'm saying data store specifically instead of database. It seems like that's where everybody should be focusing instead of figuring out how to create the next new JavaScript framework.
Well, again, you're preaching to the choir here. I 100% agree with that. I'm definitely a back-end developer from my whole career. And one of the trends, I was actually talking to an analyst at DevNexus about kind of a larger trend in the industry of, if you guys have been around long enough, you probably recognize this as well, is that there's kind of a pendulum that goes back and forth between client server and different forms over the years, right? It used to be you'd have mainframe and terminals, and then you went to personal PCs and then servers, right? And then you started out with back-end server rendering of HTML for websites, and that gradually swung to front-end and SPA frameworks, and kind of away from the back-end. We don't care about the back-end. We don't care about that's somebody else's job. We're focused on the front-end. That's where the users are. That's the first thing they see. And then there's maybe, I don't know if you guys have been picking up on this, there's a kind of a little bit of a mini backlash against SPA frameworks going on right now, whereas people are starting to move back towards maybe server-side rendering in some form. Not that we're going back to what we were doing before, but maybe we're rendering more on the server side than we have been. So I think that's also part of it, is just that kind of that macro trend of development swinging back and forth between server and client. We also see it when we talk about edge computing these days as well, where we had data centers in our offices in the closet somewhere, right? And someone that was employee of the company that would manage those and run those, and then kind of the trend to move to a cloud and have someone else manage the data center. But some of the drawbacks of that is that it's in certain parts of the world, and so edge gives us kind of mini data centers that are closer to our business, our customers, or whatever. So that's kind of another version of that trend. Things going back and forth, further and nearer. That's just kind of a macro trend that I'm seeing. Don't know if you'd all agree with that or not, but
mostly, except maybe the last part, because your own data center is furthest away from the users, with cloud being closer to users simply because you have more of those, right? I don't know of a single company that has as many data centers as, let's say, AWS, right? And then with Edge, we are even closer, kind of, look through the window. That's where it is, right?
Well, I guess not instead users in that case, but admins, right? So if you buy AWS, what do they call that? Snow cone? What is that?
Oh, one of the Snow devices, yes.
Yeah, various Snow devices. It's just like a data center that you can install on premise, but it's really an extension of a cloud. So it's just kind of another version of that. If we put everything in the cloud, but let's bring this part of it closer to us, that sort of thing.
Victor was going to mention earlier, you were talking about swinging back and forth, and we're going back to the back end for doing rendering. Now we've got WASM coming into play. Now, is that going to this is where the edge is going to become even more insane. Used to, we think edge devices is, okay, it's a Raspberry Pi sitting somewhere. It's a smaller form factor device. But now there's nothing smaller than your browser, in my opinion. And if WASM is going to take off, when are we going to start seeing replication of data sets across browsers?
WASM is slightly different, right? At least if you talk about WASM from running in a browser, which doesn't have to be, just bad name. But it's more about, actually going back. WASM is almost like going back to Java days, right? When I don't want to work with JavaScript. I'm going to write my front end in Java. Now that would be server-side rendering, but still, nevertheless, right? It's more about languages. JavaScript is not the only one, right? It's just that before WASM, it was the only one that can run in a browser, excluding weird stuff like ActionScript, right? Or whatever strange things we were doing in the past.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's been my point of view with WASM, is that it opens up the browser to other languages, right? And we've seen some of that. And I'm not I think we're still relatively early in that trend. Like I'm not sure if there's enough momentum there, for JavaScript to lose market share, let's say, to other languages, right? I just don't know if we're there yet.
It'll definitely not disappear. But
Yeah.
if you, from certain perspective, you can say that client-side applications, let's call it like that, are now the only ones that do not have variety, right? You can choose between many databases depending on what you need, right? You can choose among many platforms depending on what you need. You can choose between anything you want. I mean, for any area of software engineering, there are many choices except frontend. That's JavaScript. You can choose a framework, but you cannot choose a language, right? Now, it might probably go out that I'm not extremely fond of JavaScript myself.
Me neither, but I guess we could use Flash or Silverlight, right? We could probably... No, I'm just kidding.
You're much more exposed to it than I am. So I'm curious, what's the situation with variety of databases now within a typical company, right? Are we still talking about standard? I'm going back to when I was deeply involved in databases, right? When a typical company would choose, hey, we are using Sybase or whatever, and it does not matter what you need. That's where the data is, right? How's the situation now? How much of variety we have or don't have in the typical company today?
I'm glad you brought this up. This is actually a very interesting topic. So one of the phenomenon I've seen when talking to developers about databases is what they consider to be a database and then what they consider to be a related but not database technology. Let me give you an example of that. So I have SQL Server running in my enterprise, and that's where I'm storing my data. Would you consider a cache like Memcache or Redis or something to be a database?
I hate you now. I just lost an example that I was about to use. Oh, man.
Or if you have a search engine like Lucene or Elastic, is that a database? Right. So when I say database, when Couchbase says database, we mean all of those things. Those are all database or database related topics, right? So then that gets to the original question, like what about variety at these places? So what you might see is, yeah, they might agree on maybe everybody runs Oracle, right? Everyone runs SQL Server, something like that, right? And you may have some one-offs, some shadow IT running other databases here and there, but for the most part, it's Oracle everywhere. But then from application to application, developers might bring in those auxiliary tools for caching, for search, for flexible JSON storage. And so what you end up with then is perhaps a sprawl, a data sprawl of 4 or 5 different tools that are all have to be managed, patched, upgraded, and you have to have data pipelines in between them, right? Because I need to put some data from Oracle into my cache and data from Oracle into my search. And I have to sync my JSON data with those tools and things like that. So that has been kind of the microservices trend over the years, is each microservice has its own different database type, potentially, right? And so that's, that's fine. That's okay. But there's some issues with that, right? Having that many different databases to manage and upgrade can be painful, right? If you remember the log4j issue we had, was that last year? All the different places that log4j is hiding, all the different exploits that we have to patch and figure out. So now we have to do that in all those different databases and dozens of integrations and pipelines and tools. And then, of course, this year, one of the macro trends is maybe an economy that's, we've got a lot of layoffs in the tech sector. Some people are a little nervous about spending more money. So can we go from 15 database tools down to 10, for instance, and save some money? So that's an area that Couchbase actually focused on a lot, is trying to consolidate a little bit. Couchbase is a little bit more of a platform than it is just a one-off database, right? So you can do JSON, yeah. You can also do search and key value, cache as a building cache, mobile, etc. So that's actually a very interesting area for us, is that idea of consolidation. of that data sprawl.
What you just explained makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of those hype curves where at the top, you started with one database for absolutely everything. At the top, you have 50 or whatever the number is. And the real sweet spot is neither of those, right? Somewhere in between. You're probably not going to not use Redis for cache, right? Or you would maybe, but then you're not going to not use, I don't know, Prometheus for observability of your Kubernetes clusters, right? You are going to have more, but then you shouldn't necessarily go crazy and say, hence I should have 1,000, right?
So in talking about data sprawl, you're talking about condensing from 15 to whatever down to save money. Again, we're talking about cycles. Right now, depending on who you listen to, we are in a down economy. You can see it through the layoffs. You can see it through I've seen this in 2000, 2008. Surprisingly, there wasn't much one visible in 15, even though there was one. So we're just on that 7-year cycle, roughly, that 7 to 9 year cycle. So we're getting ready to, let's say we're coming out of that, and now people are expanding. But we're talking about upgrading. I mean, even if you condense to 8 surfaces that you have to deal with, and you fired all your people, how do we manage that? Just sanely at all? Do we outsource it always and never run our own stuff?
I don't think I have an answer to that question. That is definitely one of the risks whenever you take on a new dependency, is who's going to manage it a year from now, right? 2 years from now. And even in a up economy, right? Developers and engineers and ops people, DBAs, the average lifespan at a job is much shorter than it was, in previous generations, right? People like me who are 7 years at the same company, that's very much the exception. A lot of people do 2 or 3 years, the old dip and ship or ship and dip, and they're on to the next company. So whatever they brought on as a dependency becomes the problem of the company they left behind. So, that's definitely something you need to take into account is, do we actually need to bring in yet another database? Or is the database we have going to give us, some sort of future proofing, some additional functionality when we need it, right? So it may be just a cache right now, but can we repurpose that to do search next year? And, document user profile storage with document database the year after that sort of thing. Cool. So can that database grow with us?
Well, now you're making my point for me, I think, is we're allowing people at the bottom of the org chart to make decisions that are going to affect the top 3 tiers of an organization, meaning the executive layer. Because as soon as you've allowed somebody just to bring something in, and it was brought in as a groundswell from bottom up, usually the execs stay around longer than that 3 years. But isn't that poor governance from an organization perspective, just to allow whatever to be there?
That's a tricky one, right? Because I agree with the argument, hey, are we going to bring in another database, another hyperscaler, another language, another whatever, right? I completely agree with it. But the other extreme is equally damaging, right? Because if you say we're not going to bring yet another one, then we would all be running, I don't know, what's Sybase or whatever is before Sybase, and mainframe, and writing everything in Perl, right? Or C. What is to be challenging is, how do you find that balance? And very often companies fall into one of the two extremes, kind of, you cannot bring in anything because this is proven, or every man for himself, right?
Yeah, and I think an important factor there is, and which you're kind of alluding to, is if I'm at a company that is not willing to take a chance on some new innovative technology, do I really want to work there the rest of my career? So maybe you have now a retention issue. And I think we've seen in the news recently, again, I think it was the elections, in fact, there was issues with finding COBOL developers because they're still running something on COBOL. I think even maybe Southwest had some issues with that they put off all that technical debt, all that upgrading, and they kept putting it off until it actually caught up to them. right? So yeah, it's definitely a balance between, do we just bring in every old thing and we have Wild West versus, we're very, very conservative. You have to go through a 2-year vetting process to bring in anything sort of an environment. And I don't know if I want to work in either of those type of environments as a developer. I'd rather work in something with a nice Goldilocks balance in the middle there.
What would be your perfect working situation then? Like say you're going for that middle. What is the correct way to solve for the Wild West versus the draconian 3-year death march to get anything in?
I mean, I think if you have, I don't know if there's a policy that can solve this, unfortunately. I think it has to be, you have to have people who care about what they're building, right? And I've been in organizations before where people there are just punching clock. They don't really care what we're building with. It's just, I got to get my tickets done for the day and I'm punching out. And I've been in organizations where they care deeply about, every line of code, every technology that we're using, and they're open to trying new things. But, there should be maybe a higher bar than just bringing whatever you want. And as long as the people there care about it, care about what you're building, then if you bring in a good idea and make a pitch for it to your colleagues, then I think that should be that would be a good start of an organization there, a good team dynamic to have that in place. So I don't know. I don't think I have a policy answer for you, unfortunately.
So it sounds like that there is no easy answer, which we already knew. So if people are getting started today, they're coming out of college or not college, it doesn't really matter. Where do you think people should start today? Let's make this a really broad question. Should they be front end or back end?
I think people, generally speaking, will gravitate towards front end because the browser is something that people work with all the time, and they're just, it's a great, easy place to start learning, and you can start seeing your results right away. However, I think, I'm a back end developer. I really think that there's a lot of interesting stuff to do in the back end, and I don't see that being taught in boot camps, right? That's mostly about JavaScript, HTML, CSS, which are all valuable skills to have. And those are skills that I used even when I was working back end. But, I would like to see a little more emphasis on database, certainly, and, web servers in general. And I think learning SQL, this is kind of maybe strange coming from a NoSQL guy, but learning SQL, the language itself, that has served me more than any other skill I've learned in college, in my first job, or anything like that. So that's going to continue to be the case. So I think that's a great place to start.
So basically what you're saying is once you select star, you never go back.
I think that's the case. If you look at like Stack Overflow's results of most popular languages, JavaScript number 1, right? HTML, CSS 2 and 3. Python's up there, but SQL is generally speaking in the top 5. And I think there's a reason for that. It's a great language, and that just about anybody, no matter what their language of choice is, can end up using and getting value from.
It's kind of the beauty of SQL. I feel that it might be one of the easier entry points into a language. I know that it requires time to be an expert and really know your stuff. That's valid for any other language, right? But one can start writing SQL in almost no time after the introduction, in a way, right? Which is, to me, some people kind of, it's too simple, but to me, that's the beauty of it, right? Just as I don't work for a long time in C, but it's similar like C. It's a beautiful, simple language.
I think that one thing that even coming out of college or boot camp that you underestimate, is something that certainly I underestimated, is the amount of time you spend writing code versus the amount of time you spend reading code. I spend a lot more time reading code, or at least I should. And SQL is a very readable language. It's designed to be that way. It's designed to be as close to an English sentence as possible. So I think it's a really great language, and that's one of the reasons why.
And we can talk about portability, whether you're writing a Java app, a Go app, let's assume for a moment you're not using the object relational mappers to get things simple, and you're actually still having to write SQL. Well, if you're working in Java one day and you're putting SQL in, and you're working in JavaScript and you're putting SQL in, and you're working in Go and you're putting SQL in, it's all the same SQL. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree. And even if you go from, say, Oracle to SQL Server or SQL Server to Couchbase, like there's going to be syntax differences, right? But for the most part, you will have, at least 90% of the knowledge you need to start writing queries in other databases as well. So it works as almost an industry standard. Of course, it's an ANSI standard, but it really works.
I'm going to say probably something very silly, but when NoSQL appeared, I was almost immediately on board, because I did feel and still feel that we need more variety, let's put it that way, right? But I haven't seen a reason back then or even today not to use SQL as a language to communicate with that database, right? And I have a feeling as if people think it's kind of one or the other in a way, kind of, hey, if it's SQL database, it needs to be SQL. If it's not SQL database, it cannot be SQL. Which for the life of me, I cannot understand what's wrong with SQL as a language.
It sounds like you would be a great fit at Couchbase, because that's definitely the kind of thinking that we're on board with. It's the best of both worlds thinking, where NoSQL to us is not about throwing away all the great stuff that relational has done for the industry. It's about learning from that and applying that to other, methods of storing data. And in our case, JSON data and key value type data. So yes, I absolutely agree with you. I think, SQL was designed separately from the relational database, actually. If you go back to the 70s, E.F. Codd is the one who proposed the relational model. He did not invent SQL, actually. He had another language, I forget what it was called, that didn't catch on. I think it's called Alpha. It didn't really catch on. And it was actually a couple of people, Chamberlain and Boyce, which you might have heard of from Boyce, Codd, normal form fame, that came along and said, we need a English-like language for working with data, kind of like COBOL, to make working with data something that a regular person could do, not just a mathematician. And I bring this up because Don Chamberlain is actually one of Couchbase's advisors, and he's written a book about SQL for Couchbase called SQL++. And so, I think that we can do cool, new, innovative stuff with NoSQL while still learning from and respecting all the great work that people before us have done.
It's always interesting when people break out EF Codd and CJ Date. It's like, were all the database guys back then, it was initials and last name? It's just what it seems like. I don't know. Those were my heroes and still are. I just need to find the books again. They're somewhere dusty, probably in the attic. So we've talked about Couchbase just as we've been going back and forth. But let me give you the stage and talk about Couchbase. I mean, it just sounds like I can run it on my little flashlight here that's running, right? I can run it anywhere. Or am I wrong with that?
It depends. Does your flashlight have some, does it run on an ARM processor or something like that?
Well, no, not today.
Probably not. So,
maybe this weekend. We'll see.
Couchbase you can run on, I think the best place to start these days, people like the database as a service, the cloud-based managed database. So we have that called Couchbase Capella. It's a great place to start. If you're more interested in, and you want to have more control over deploying and tuning your database, you can deploy it to Kubernetes, of course, with the operator pattern. And then, of course, if you just want to run it directly, you can download it for Windows, Mac, and various Linux distros are supported, and just run it on-prem if you'd like. So lots of options there. There's also a mobile option if you want to. I think we discussed briefly syncing data between browsers and data center. We're not quite there yet with Couchbase, but certainly syncing data between native apps automatically, which is a great feature of that. I'm not much of a mobile developer, but that's a pretty cool feature, I think.
And that's always a hard problem to solve, is data with mobile.
It absolutely is. I actually worked on a project before I came to Couchbase where they wanted a mobile app, and they wanted the content to be available even when there's no connection. And so we spent probably 8-9 months writing some synchronization code and APIs to sync data between SQLite and SQL Server. And even after those 8-9 months, it was still really janky and hard to make work. And I didn't know about Couchbase Mobile at the time, but that probably would have saved us, at least 8 months of trouble writing all that sync stuff so we could then focus on the actual business value instead of all that plumbing code. So, yeah, that's a nice thing.
So all of Matt's contact information will be down in the episode description. But Matt, if people wanted to get in touch with you, what is the easiest way, ignoring all the stuff that we're going to have listed below?
I'll generally respond to just about everything. I won't respond to Facebook because that's just for friends and family. But I'm on Twitter. M Groves on Twitter is fine. My LinkedIn is fine too. If you're avoiding Twitter these days, that's totally fine. I'm on there as well. And you can contact me at my Couchbase email address. That's totally fine. It's matthew.groves@couchbase.com. That's Matthew with 2 T's.
And I am assuming that you're at pretty much every conference that exists.
It feels like it. It definitely feels like it. We're ramping back up. I mean, I was at the point of probably, in 2019, probably 20 plus conferences a year, plus user groups and things. And we're starting to get ramping back up to that. So I will probably see you at the next conference. Whoever is listening, I'll see you at that conference.
Okay. Before we hang up here, I want to ask, because you just brought it up, conferences are one thing, but you said user groups. Are those actually still a thing?
I mean, again, they're starting to come back to life. Some are taking some tentative steps to virtual meetups again, and some are full bore back in person, meeting on a regular basis. So when I say user groups, I mean user groups, meetups, monthly gatherings of like-minded individuals. Yeah.
That are ranging anywhere from 10 to 200 people, probably.
Yep. Yes.
All right. So I'm going to dig in just a little bit more.
Sure.
Listeners, sorry, I'm going to drag this out just a little bit. Where do you see those happening? Are they big city? Are they coastal? What are you seeing from those user groups?
I mean, it depends on the type of user group you're looking for. So I think in just about any, let's say, any city with an airport, let's just put it that way, you could find a .NET user group, a JavaScript user group, probably a Java user group as well. All those things are in here in where I live, Columbus, Ohio. Maybe what used to be called a SQL Pass user group. I think it's usually they've changed their names now to something else because Pass has been dissolved, but you're going to find those. Now, if you're looking for something a little more specific, like a Couchbase user group or a Kafka user group, you probably got to go to the bigger cities for that. So New York, Chicago, San Francisco, San Jose, that sort of thing, to get a good in-person crowd.
And that's really where I was trying to head is people ask, okay, I'm new to tech. What kind of job should I get? Really, the question is, okay, what do you want to do? And you need to move to a city that's doing that thing if that's what you want to do, which may not be your little, I live out in the country in North Carolina. There's nothing out here. I've got a Target and I've got a gas station. That's it. And it's not even a full Target.
I think there's been a pretty big shift to remote work. For better or for worse these days. The reason for it is the worst part, but it is a silver lining. On the other side of the coin, starting out your first job in remote has got to be very, very challenging. So yes, I would agree. Go someplace where you can maybe work in person for a little while before you're comfortable with remote, or at least find a group of people and network in your local area that you can meet with in person and interact with face to face. So I think that's a very valuable thing to get used to, at least when you're starting out. I've been remote for probably 10 years, something like that. So it's second nature to me at this point. But definitely when I was starting out, I was very nervous about it. And I really relied heavily on my local user groups and networks for those face-to-face interactions.
It's always interesting to see a human every once in a while. Just don't know how to react.
Go to your local coffee shop.
Oh no, those aren't real people. Of course, they could say that of me as well. So all this stuff right here at the end was free to everybody. Actually, this is always free to you. So thanks for listening. Matt, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Darren and Victor.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.